Welcome to another Pearson Center webinar on the theme of COVID and beyond. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm an advisory board member of the Pearson Center. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Center is a progressive centrist think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I am pleased to welcome you to the 12th webinar on major policy issues related to COVID-19 and how they are affecting our society. Our ongoing project is called COVID and Beyond, recognizing that we have a lot of issues to address in this era of COVID-19 and that the recovery and rebuilding will be slow and long and require time to reimagine Canada. Today, we will talk about infrastructure as a tool for economic recovery and rebuilding. Before doing that, though, I'll briefly share some information on our upcoming seminars, which will include special guests such as the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, Ambassador Bob Rae, and Minister Marco Mendicino. Please visit our website for more information at thepearsoncentre, all in one word, .ca. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make these events possible. The event sponsored today is Aurora Strategies, who I am pleased to say was one of our founding sponsors back in 2013. And our two sustaining sponsors are, of course, Canada's Building Trades Union and, of course, the International Association of Firefighters. So thank you very much to both of those organizations. While these webinars are free to attend, please feel free to visit the Pearson Center website and make a contribution. Again, the address is thepearsoncentre.ca. Now back to the panel. We have a very special guest with us today. The Honourable Catherine McKenna is the MP for Ottawa Centre and Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. Minister McKenna was first elected in 2015. In the previous Parliament, she served as Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and since November of 2019, she has been Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. She's a strong voice for progressive politics, especially the environment and women in politics. I'm also pleased to tell you that our moderator today is Brian Gallant, who's also an advisory board member of the Pearson Center. And of course, he's also the 33rd Premier of New Brunswick and currently serves as the CEO of the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation at Navigator Limited. With respect to the format, the discussion will last about 30 minutes and then be followed by a Q&A period with you, the audience, before we end promptly at 2:45 Eastern Time. Please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as possible. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pearson YouTube channel later on this afternoon. Just go to YouTube and search for Pearson Center. On that note, I will turn it over to you, Brian.
Merci beaucoup, Francesca. Thank you everyone for joining us for this wonderful webinar and discussion on infrastructure and economic recovery. Merci à vous tous et toutes d'être parmi nous. We're very excited to have the minister here. Just a quick reminder that we do want to hear from you, so send in your questions at around the 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to go to those questions, so please try to send them in before that. And of course, we want to promptly finish at 2:45 p.m. Eastern time so everybody can get on with the rest of their day. We want to have a robust discussion. So first off, a big thank you to Minister McKenna. We really do appreciate you making time for us. How are you doing?
I'm great, Brian. I was just saying, if you come and look in this room, though, like I have kids running around, a dog, you know, just living the dream. I know it's a really challenging time for everyone. I feel, you know, that my circumstances are pretty fortunate, but you know, it's tough. It's tough, you know, working, organizing children, and of course, working with not only, you know, government to support folks, but also I represent Ottawa Centre, so it's you know, really seeing the impacts of the pandemic on businesses, on individuals, on moms, on a whole range of people. But look, we've got to move forward, and I think Canadians are really doing their part. So good to see, and excited about my portfolio because I think there's some real opportunities.
Well, I think everybody listening is excited about hearing about your portfolio and how you see it playing a role in the economic recovery. So let's get on with some of the questions. Of course, you and your colleagues have been very focused on the response to COVID-19, and we're assuming the preparations for the recovery stage as well. What has been and what will be the role of infrastructure in the response to the pandemic, in the recovery phase, and in the rebuilding of the economy?
So it's a great question. I mean, I think it's good to just start from first principles. Why is infrastructure so important? We have an aging population, and the only way to grow GDP, which of course we want to do, and grow our economy and also pay for all the programs that are so critically important, is either by immigration or through investments in infrastructure. And this was pointed out by the Economic Advisory Panel. It seems many, many moons ago that we had Dominic Barton who wrote about this, about the importance of infrastructure. It's also a multiplier, so that every dollar you put in can have multiple benefits, both in terms of GDP, jobs, but also looking at how do you build a cleaner future, how do you build a more inclusive future. So if you start with that, infrastructure is always important to the economy, and we have a $180 billion infrastructure plan. $33 billion is through bilateral agreements with provinces, so incredibly important, those partnerships, as well as with municipalities. And so, you know, it's always been incredibly important. I started off before the pandemic when I came in looking at how do we do a national infrastructure assessment and really plan for our longer term needs in a very targeted way. I believe in outcomes, and I think you need to be very clear what are the goals you're trying to achieve so you maximize taxpayer dollars, and really do those big pieces, like when we've talked about finally getting rail in the corridor, high frequency, high speed rail in the corridor. Those big pieces, we need to really, you know, look down the road. Then COVID-19 hit, and my title is also Minister of Communities. And I didn't really understand what that meant. And I think suddenly we all understand how important our local communities are and the infrastructure that we have around us. So, you know, that it's whether you have, you know, good schools, whether you have good, you know, businesses, whether you have good services, the people that are working in these as essential workers, nature. And I think that that's reimagined, in some ways that's had an impact on reimagining the importance of investments in infrastructure. And then something else happened, and we've got a lot of progressives listening, Black Lives Matter. And also, I mean, just all we've seen a lot of racism. There's systemic racism, absolutely, including towards Indigenous peoples, and looking at where are we spending our infrastructure dollars. So I've spent a lot of time talking with our chief statistician, with economists, looking at, okay, we need to better understand where are we making these investments. It's not just how much you're investing, it's not just what you're investing in, it's who is actually benefiting. And I think that we need to do better when it comes to making sure that the most vulnerable are actually getting these investments, because that's how you succeed. Clean drinking water, roof over your head, access, you know, to high-speed broadband. We all now understand how important that is. So these are all the pieces. And then, of course, there's the recovery phase. So spent a lot of time. I've been, you know, working away on these. I'm really doing some thinking about, you know, what we can be doing on infrastructure, but also how does it support recovery in the short term, which is jobs, economic growth, some pandemic resilience that we need to be thinking about, and then the longer term, which I think are still the goals that we've always had: cleaner future, making sure that we have a more inclusive society. And infrastructure plays a huge role. So we've reimagined some of our programs. So our bilateral agreements with provinces, we've brought in a COVID stream that will allow us to advance projects quickly that you know are more shovel worthy, as we like to say. So ones that could be retrofits, that could be repurposing facilities to deal with COVID-19, that really are going to mean jobs, but also are consistent with our goals. And then thinking in the longer term about stimulus, and that's a whole of government. I should be very clear. The Prime Minister has said, you know, he's going to be leading that. But how do we get out of this? We're still absolutely in the health pandemic, but we have an economic, you know, crisis as well. And so understanding what the challenges are, it's very different than anything we've ever seen before. And that figuring out how do we come out of this stronger, more resilient, where everyone's succeeding, where we have good jobs, and we've also placed ourselves well for the future.
Fantastic. Lots to unpack there. Thank you for that. During turbulent economic times, many governments will look to use infrastructure to help stimulate the economy. And as you mentioned, it can have an amplifying effect, which makes it all that much more attractive as one of the tools to use to try to re-spark economic growth and activity. So when it comes to the government, obviously there's public infrastructure, but also how will the government proceed to try to get large-scale projects approved, shovels in the ground as quickly as possible, whether they be private, whether they be public, and how you get all those partners to get together when large-scale projects often can take some time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with my portfolio. You can have massive investments, and then you can have smaller scale projects, retrofitting of a community center. So you have a large scale renewable. And so obviously how long a project takes, or a large scale public transit project, if you're going to do a new metro line, that's going to take some time. But of course, we need to be moving as quickly as possible, and it requires partnerships. So we have been working away. I have to give my department a lot of credit on approving a whole range of projects very, kind of quietly, while, we were all still trying to deal with the health pandemic, which continues. But we've been looking at what are the other opportunities. So one of the things that we have a real opportunity to use is the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So people may have seen that now we have Michael Sabia, new leadership. He was head of the Caisse de dépôt. A lot of respect for him in the business world, and I think by Quebecers, because their investments, their savings were being invested by that case. And so we're looking at how does the bank really play a big role in, how does the bank play a really big role when it comes to making some really big investments? This is how do you bring in the private sector for some of these projects? And some people have said, well, wait a minute, why would you want to do that? Because we need more infrastructure, and we have a huge opportunity. We have pension funds who are investing in projects in other countries. We should be using that capital here. Not every project is suitable, but if you're looking at transmission lines between provinces, those are extremely big projects. There are opportunities to bring in the private sector. So, you got to look at the big things, the small things. But the one thing I've realized is really important is that how do we maximize the dollars we have? And as I said, how do you bring in more dollars? Because the infrastructure investments that we need are massive. And I think we owe it to taxpayers to be very focused on getting value for dollars. That's why I guess maybe I'm a mom. I'm quite cheap. I make sure the money goes, that we can stretch the money. And so when you make these investments, can we bring in, is there opportunities with the private sector? What is the role of the provinces, role of municipalities? It's quite challenging. So in some cases we've looked at with our COVID stream, how can we maybe contribute a bit more? And then also, how do we make sure that we're moving to a cleaner future? Because there's a huge cost to not doing that and a huge opportunity to doing that. And then once again, as I pointed out, also really focused on, are we making the investments in Indigenous communities? So Indigenous peoples have the same opportunities to succeed. In communities, that may be racialized, that you may not see the same investments. And so it's a huge portfolio, huge opportunity. And I think we've been really focused on how do we get value for dollars? How do we get projects going ahead quickly? How do we get the jobs going? But also, how do we make the long-term investments that are critical to really positioning ourselves to be a leader, but also so that every Canadian can succeed? So there's a lot, but it's a very practical portfolio. And you know what, as I say, it's kind of good. I was a Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Now I have money. So people, sometimes it's a little bit easier. Not that you and I ever disagreed, Brian.
Yeah, in environment, you might have found yourself asking for money more than, but it's all good. And it's an interesting point that you're segueing into, because I think you've touched upon the idea that you want to bring a lens in terms of how the infrastructure investments can address inequalities. With your previous portfolio, and I know you care deeply about protecting the environment and combating climate change, as many Canadians do, how do you bring that lens to the infrastructure investments that are being made by the government, and even the programming that has been made and maybe reformed due to COVID?
look, I mean, you can't be, as I say to folks, you either, when you invest in infrastructure dollar, you're either increasing emissions or you're reducing emissions. You're either building something that's going to be more resilient to climate change or less resilient to climate change. And so we need to have a climate lens. And that is something we also owe to Canadians, because there's a huge cost if we don't. I mean, imagine thinking you're building something for 50 and 100 years. Sadly, because of climate change, the world is going to look different. Hopefully we will be ambitious and the impacts will be less, but we're already seeing the impacts with flooding, with droughts, with thawing permafrost. So you need to think about that when you build, and we need to move to a cleaner future. So we have a climate lens that's applied. There's different ways. So, I mean, there's an overarching climate lens when you look at a project and what are the impacts. Then there is, how do you build? So I've become quite obsessed with building materials, because Canada is actually a leader in low carbon building materials. So cross laminated timber, I saw buildings in California made large, now we can do tall wood buildings. We have low carbon concrete with Carbon Cure out of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, great, great company. That we have Elysis, so it's carbon-free aluminum. And so I think we have an opportunity to do that. And then, of course, as we look forward to the investments we're going to make, Joe Biden today was just announcing his $1 trillion infrastructure, clean energy plan. That's the ambition I think we need. We need to be thinking about these investments are going to be good because they're going to create good jobs. They're going to make us more competitive, but they're also going to ensure we have a sustainable future. So going back to every single dollar we spend, we need to be thinking about how is it building the future we want and getting real outcomes and the GDP growth that we had talked about, that I started at the very beginning with, because that is what infrastructure, the real opportunity.
So just a quick reminder to everyone listening that in about 10 minutes, we're going to take some of your questions, try to get through as many of them as possible. So please send them in the chat portion of this webinar. Minister, you spoke about sort of the future. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball. One thing that we're certainly all experiencing during this pandemic is working from home. As I say that as I'm sitting at my kitchen table here in Schneegbrugge, New Brunswick. What will that be doing to the decisions that you will need to make as the minister and the government will need to make when it comes to infrastructure, especially when it comes to transportation infrastructure? When we think, at least for the foreseeable future, there'll probably be less people needing to get on the subway and get on the highways and the roads to get to work, at least for now. And who knows what that will look like in a few months and in a few years. So how is it influencing perhaps the approach of the government and the approach of your portfolio?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, look, I don't think any of us know how long this is going to last. But once again, to infrastructure decisions, we're not making a decision just for tomorrow. It's very hard to actually get shovels of ground really quickly. I mean, we're making decisions for the longer term. So I think we still need to stay on our course. We are still making historic investments in public transportation. We need to. Rail, we need to be doing that. Active transportation, that people actually want to be able to get around. I think that, I mean, one of the areas, so I'm going to talk a bit from the transportation side and go to broadband. One of the things that we have seen a huge weakness is a lack of high-speed broadband in rural and remote areas. And why when I say that, it makes it sound like it's just, like a few places. It's actually, that's a lot of Canada and that's a lot of Canadians. And that's an equity issue as much as a productivity issue, because if you cannot go online, maybe you can't run your business, your kids can't be homeschooled, you don't have access to your doctor. And so we need to be more ambitious. I know our government, we were thinking about how do we do that, how we had talked about, making sure that we had high-speed broadband across the country by 2030. That is not acceptable to Canadians, I don't think. I think we need to really ramp up the ambition accelerator for productivity, for growth, because people are doing a lot more online.
We'll have lots of patience in asking the questions. And again, we apologize to everybody for the delay and for the technical challenges. I was just saying we're going to need better broadband in Ottawa. So with that said, there's a question of what role the federal government could play through infrastructure to help address potential long-term care homes, childcare accessibility challenges during the pandemic, and really forevermore. So if you could maybe touch upon that lens that people are wondering if it can be put on in terms of the investments.
So I'm going to try to get on my phone so I can join this, but to the extent you can hear me now,
Can hear you.
look, okay, you can hear me. Well, you've asked a number of different questions. I don't know that you got many answers. So coastal infrastructure is key, and we're doing a lot of thinking, I think, on inclusiveness and where we invest the money. Now, we've announced we're moving forward on hundreds of projects right now, and that's really important, working with communities and provinces. But I think there's understanding the data and really making sure that those investments are actually making a difference in those communities are important. We've also adapted to allow for pandemic-related infrastructure. So through this COVID stream, how do we adapt, whether it's a school or a hospital or something that, when you need to adapt to the pandemic, as I say, we need to be nimble. And we're going to continue looking at opportunities. The Prime Minister has said, we are here to support Canadians. There's a lot of discussions going on with provinces in terms of the $14 billion that we've committed to support provinces. So there's opportunities there. I know people are keen about municipalities. We need to be supporting municipalities, including they have challenges with respect to public transit costs. But I think we're going to continue doing that. And then also thinking about, the longer term and where do we go from here? And, we're spending time over the summer really figuring out, okay, what is the impact of COVID? What's it shown in terms of the weaknesses? I think it's shown areas where we already had challenges, like long-term care, like, childcare, like, you can go through a whole range of, like high-speed broadband, that we need to be working on. And I think we can come out of this more resilient, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take everyone working together.
Fantastic, and we hear you well now, so thank you for that, and thank you for everyone that's still on for their patience. And you touched upon this, Minister, already, but I just want to allow, if you want to expand, because a lot of the questions coming in have to do with how there can be lenses put onto the infrastructure decisions and investments to help, as you've mentioned throughout this interview, inequalities, help racialized communities, help ensure that women are going to be able to partake in the economic recovery equally, and many other groups that may be vulnerable or suffering or having challenges, even pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. So with that said, is there anything else you'd like to expand on that, and maybe how has the government been able to really sit down and say, okay, with this pandemic, infrastructure is such an important tool, we really got to reconsider how we're making the decisions to ensure that we address all of these other elements as well?
Looking at the impact on racialized communities, on women, on Indigenous peoples. And I think part of it is data, really understanding where the investments are being made. Many of the decisions, the way our program is structured, are made by the province in consultation with the local communities. But I think we need to just make sure, are they, for everyone's sake, are those dollars actually supporting communities that need investments? Or are they just going to communities that are the loudest, or, have, a whole variety of reasons you might make investments that are good, but we need to be making sure that Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, new immigrants, that they have these investments in infrastructure that are critically important, not just because it's nice to build things, but because it can create jobs for people who live in these communities, but because it can provide more opportunities for children, for seniors to go to community centers, because access to transportation, if you live further from downtown, you can get around to wherever you have to go in a more affordable way and in a more clean way. So those are reflections that, we've always had, but I think it has become more clear than ever that there are vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and we really need to be thinking hard about them, and how I think very hard about how infrastructure can play a role in helping solve them.
Well, fantastic. Well, look, we're already at about that time. So, Minister, certainly want to thank you again. I'd like to give you an opportunity, though, to add anything that maybe we didn't cover. You have hopefully still a lot of the people that had signed in still on, even though we had some technical difficulties. And people that have joined, I assume, are very interested in infrastructure, obviously interested in the economic recovery as well. So is there anything that some of the people that are listening should know? Is there anything that they can do? Any messages that you may have for them?
How do we build a more resilient future? How do we build a more resilient economy? And that requires ambition. And I think that, you want to say it, but it is true that a crisis does bring in an opportunity, and the opportunity is to look at how do we do things better? How do we make investments in broadband so everyone can access the internet? How do we, I think I'm gone. I don't know if you can still hear me, but how do we ensure we're moving to a cleaner future? How do we make sure we're more resilient to pandemics, and it's not the most vulnerable that are the ones that are really paying the price? So I think those are the reflections we're having. Of course, we continue to approve projects and move forward, but I think we also need to be making those longer term decisions and be ambitious. Be ambitious. I think that we were lucky to live in a great country, but we are progressives and we believe that we can do better, and that there are opportunities out there, and that we can ensure everyone has a chance to succeed. So those are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And of course, wearing my former hat as Minister of Environment and Climate Change, I certainly am very focused on how do we ensure a more sustainable future.
Well, what a wonderful and inspiring note to finish this webinar on, to have our country take the crisis as also an opportunity to be able to really create a more sustainable and inclusive future. So thank you very much for that inspiring message. Merci infiniment à la ministre McKenna pour avoir pris du temps avec nous. Merci à vous tous et toutes pour nous avoir joints aujourd'hui. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us, and for those that got through the whole thing, even through the part of the technical difficulties. We really do appreciate it. We're just trying to demonstrate how important the internet and broadband is during these times. And of course, we again invite you to join us for future conversations that the Pearson Center for Progressive Policy will have in the very near future. And please continue to be engaged on these important topics, and everyone stay safe and stay well. À bientôt. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.